Hello. This is Steve Faulkner, along with Makoto Ueki. We are hosting the following session with Russ Weekly. I got to read out some stuff. Welcome back to Inclusive Design 24 2020, brought to you in partnership with Barclays Access, Adobe, Intopia Technological, InfoAxia, Intuit, and WebAble. You can follow us on Twitter at the at ID24 Conference, and if you have questions for the presenters, tweet using the hash ID24 hashtag for our Q&A at the end of the session. Just a reminder, the ID24 is a respectful community, and you can find our code of conduct on the inclusivedesign.24 event site. Over to you, Makoto.
Hi, everyone. I'm Makoto from Tokyo, Japan. Thank you so much for having me here as a co-host. Next, we have Russ Weekly talking about what are accessible names and why should you care? Over to you, Russ.
Thank you very much. Okay, well, let's talk about that. What are these accessible name things and why should you care? So before learning about accessible names, I'm going to cover off 3 topics because we need to understand them before we get to accessible names. So I'm going to talk a little bit about accessible APIs, a bit about the DOM, and a bit about the accessibility tree. Now, for those that have just watched Sarah's presentation, she did this incredible job of going through them in a lot of detail. But I'm sort of assuming here that some of you may not have watched that talk and come straight to this presentation. So I'm going to give a brief overview of those topics and then dive into accessible names. So let's kick off. And what we're going to start with is accessibility APIs. So these are going to be very, very high level little discussions, but I'm assuming some of you might not even know what an API is. So API stands for Application Programming Interface. And APIs are basically software intermediaries, I can't even say that, intermediaries that allow 2 or more applications to talk to each other. And one of the best examples might be something like Twitter. So Twitter has its own API. And if you wanted to pull tweets onto your web application, you could use Twitter's API to do that. So it allows your applications to talk to Twitter's application fundamentally. But what about accessibility APIs? So these are APIs that can communicate information about the user interface from the browser to assistive technologies. And I have a highly detailed technical diagram here, basically 3 boxes on a page. At the left, we have browser, and then we have, in the middle, we have accessibility API, and then assistive technology. And the accessibility API allows information to pass backwards and forwards. Now, accessibility APIs expose information about objects within the UI to assistive technologies, and they can include things like the object's role, is it a landmark, those sort of things, its name and description, and we're going to talk about its name a lot later on, its properties, and its possible states. Now, there are a wide range of accessibility APIs, and I'll just put a list here. I'll share this slide deck afterwards, but I won't go into it. There's many, many of them. And in some cases, browsers use one, and they might use multiple, depending on the different browsers. But it's worth reading a bit more on them so you understand about them. The next one I want to talk about is the DOM. So again, assuming some of you might not even know what that means, it stands for the Document Object Model. And it's basically an interface that takes XHTML or XML or HTML and converts it into a tree structure. And each branch of the tree ends in a node, and each node contains objects, etc. And you can see it in most browsers, and the quickest way to do it is with the inspect element. So here's a quick screenshot of what happens if you open up Chrome and you look at a web page and you hit inspect element. At the left, you've got the DOM tree, and to the right, generally, depending on how you've set it up, you would have styles that relate to that DOM tree. So there we go. And the last one I want to talk about before we get into the big topic is the accessibility tree. So browsers use the DOM tree, and they create a second tree called the accessibility tree. And it's basically a simplified version of the DOM tree. And again, I've got a very detailed diagram for you, basically 2 boxes. We've got the DOM tree on the left and the accessibility tree on the right. So basically, the DOM tree gets used to build the accessibility tree. And the accessibility tree is exposed to assistive technologies via the accessibility API. So here we go. Now we're getting more complex with our diagrams. And this one might be slightly misleading, but we'll use it as a guide anyway. So we've got the DOM tree, we've got the accessibility tree, the API between them, the accessibility API, and then the assistive technology over the far right. Of course, that's not always the case because it doesn't automatically always interact just with the accessibility tree, but we'll leave it that way for now. Now, the accessibility trees they must contain only accessible objects, and they're basically things that can receive focus and have states, properties, events, etc., those sort of things. All other nodes, DOM nodes, just aren't presented as part of the accessibility tree. So if we take a very simple example, I've got a bit of code on screen. We have a parent, which is called a div with a class of container. Inside that, we have a form. Inside the form, we have two other divs, and they've got class of form container. And in the first container, we have label and input. And in the second container, we have button. So that's what the DOM tree might look like. But when we get to look at the accessibility tree, depending on the browser, what it'll probably do is strip it right back to very basics, like a form, the label, the input, the button. So it's stripped it right back. And all those non-essentials, like the divs, etc., which are generic containers, aren't needed for the accessibility tree. Now, each browser could potentially present slightly different versions of the accessibility tree, etc. But again, you can view it in the browser. Now, again, Sarah talked about this at length. Fantastic talk before, but again, for those who haven't done it, you can do it through Chrome or Firefox. And so if you're using Chrome, you can set it up so it has an accessibility tab. And the accessibility tab is over at the right. And basically what that allows you to do is have the DOM tree and the accessibility tree beside each other. And then you can see how they interact. You can also do it with Firefox developer tools. And basically you can do the same sort of thing. You can even go through the DOM and see exactly what's going on. Both of them allow you to interact with the accessibility tree. So before we get on to accessible names, let's put those together into a little example. So we're going to put accessibility API, the DOM, and accessibility tree into action. And in this example, what we're going to do is step through what would happen if a screen reader user goes to an application, they navigate the application, and they activate a button. So we're just going to do sort of three things. And this is like a very simplified version of the steps that are going to take place. But basically, the screen reader user types a URL, hits enter, HTTP request goes off to the browser. The resulting HTML is delivered to the browser. Step 3, the browser creates a DOM tree. The browser also creates this accessibility tree. And then the screen reader can navigate the web application by accessing the accessibility tree via the accessible API. Now, when the user focuses on a button, it's exposed by the accessibility tree and announced to the assistive technology user. And it might say something like save button. And if the user likes what they're hearing and that's what they want to hit, then they can activate that button, and that information is relayed back to the app via the accessibility API. And then the web application can do what it normally does to, save that function or whatever. But the question really going on here is, how did the browser know to announce the button as save to assistive technologies? And that's really where accessible names comes into play. So finally, we're getting to the point of the talk. Accessible names. So all accessible objects within the accessibility tree excuse me, should have meaningful accessible names. And these names are used by assistive technologies to identify those objects. Now, like we talked about before, you can see those accessible names by viewing the accessibility tree. And I'm going to give a quick example here. It's based on the one we talked about before. It's basically a button with text of save. And here's a very, very complicated piece of code on screen. We have a button start tag and end tag, which is a button element, and the text inside says save. So using Chrome's accessibility tree, we can look at the computer name of the button at save. So I've taken a screenshot here, and basically we have the accessibility tree, then we've got computed properties, and then name equals save. So we can see that the browser has computed that that's the value for that button. But it gets back to the question I asked before, like how do browsers know to define the accessible name for each object? And this is where we come to probably the most wonderful document ever written in the history of documents. And that's saying a lot because the W3C documents are all fantastic documents. But this document is called the Accessible Name and Description Computation, version 1.1. And this specification describes how browsers determine the name and descriptions of every accessible object in Accessibility Tree. And basically, it allows browsers to create a name and define it as a text string. That's what we really want to get to here, is a text string. So we're going to step through this joyous computation document. And I'm going to give you a bit of a caveat here. What I'm going to do is an extremely simplified version of these steps, because if I did it in detail, either myself or all of you would be crying by the end of it. But the other thing is it would take us an entire day, and it would be kind of painful. So very, very simplified version of this document. Let's start with step A. So step A says, if the current node is not, and I'm just going to move this because I can't see my screen. I've leave it there. If the current node is not directly referenced by an ARIA label by, described by a label, then, or an attribute, then return an empty string. So we're going to use an example to explain this. In this example I'm going to show you, we've got an input and a label. However, this evil developer did not explicitly associate them using the for and ID values. And therefore, the input can't find accessible name and returns an empty string. So here's our code on screen. We have label, street address, and input equals type equals text. But because the label and input aren't explicitly associated, the accessible name is an empty string. Step B, we're rolling through this now. Otherwise, if the computed name of the current node has ARIA label by as an attribute that contains at least one valid ID ref, process the IDs in the order they occur. So let's use an example of that. So this time we have an input, and it's got an ARIA label by attribute and two separate values, A and B. So, bit of code on screen, input, type equals text, ARIA-label by, and then the value inside that is A space B. Now, keep in mind, this is not to say this is a good practice. I'm just using these as examples. So what it's really going to look for is two elements with an ID of A and an ID of B. And it turns out, luckily, they're also in the document. Otherwise, it'd be really stuffed. So we have a P with an ID of A and another P element with an ID of B. It's irrelevant where they're P elements, they can be divs, etc. But anyway, there's these two elements sitting here. The text inside the P with an ID of A is help text. So that's literally what it says. And inside the ID of B, it says error message. So the contents of these two elements become the accessible name for the input. And the accessible name is computed based on the ID, based on the order that they're defined in the ARIA label by attribute. So in this case, it says ARIA labeled by, and then A space B. So it's going to read out A and then B, or the text string from A and the text string from B. So the accessible name here would be help text error message. That's the computed accessible name. We're up to step C, rolling. Otherwise, if the computed name has an ARIA labeled attribute that's not an empty string, use the ARIA label. So let's use another example. In this case, we have a button and it's got an ARIA label, so that'll become the accessible name. So what we have here is a button and a closed button tag. So that's a button element. And inside, the developers put just an X symbol. So sometimes developers do this when they put it in a modal or something like that, where they want to close that button and they just want to use an X, which is sort of the work of Satan, but yeah, we can fix that. So the problem with that is its accessible name at this point would just be X. But if we put ARIA-label and then we can write close modal, that will become the accessible name. So it gives much more value to assistive technologies. Step D. Okay, now we're getting a bit more complicated. If the current node's native markup provides an attribute like title or an element like the label that defines a text alternative, return that order in the form of a text string unless it's got role equals presentation or role equals none. Is that a long mouthful? So let's look at an example. This time now we have a label and an input explicitly associated with a for and ID. So this is much better. So let's have a quick look. We have label for with the value of subverb, and then input ID suburb. So now they're explicitly associated. The text within the label says your suburb. So the accessible name for that input would be your suburb. Now, in the following example, the image has an alt attribute that contains a text string. And similarly, this means that the alt attribute provides a text alternative for the image, and that's used as the accessible name. So, bit of text on screen, image, alt attribute says round ball, and then source says ball.png. So the accessible name in this case is round ball. Too easy. But let's talk about, we were talking about the work of Satan a second ago. Let's talk about the title attribute. Now that's a special case and we need to pull that apart differently. Apart from anything else, this attribute is very bad and has all sorts of problems that should be avoided. And in fact, Steve, who introduced this session, has written copious articles on this, filled with vitriol and rage, as it should be. So in reality, the title attribute is really meant to be used as descriptive text, but it can be used as an accessible name, but it's only promoted to that sort of thing if there's no other accessible name that can be computed. So let's go back to our image element, but this time there's no alt attribute, but there is a title. And so in that case, the title becomes the text alternative and therefore can be used for the accessible name. So image element, title equals another ball, source equals ball.png. So because there's no alt attribute, the accessible name is another ball.
Sorry, Ross, can I just jump
yes.
in for 1 second?
Yeah.
I'm sorry to interrupt you. We're getting a little bit of rustling from your microphone when you're moving
my
your
apologies.
arms. So just
I'll
wanted
keep
to let
still.
you know.
Thanks for that. So what about if we have both a title and an alt attribute? So in those cases, we'll always use the alt attribute instead. So in the following example, we have both, and the alt attribute is going to be used. So image, alt, round ball, title, another ball, source equals ball.png. So because the alt will win, the accessible name is going to be round ball. Step E. You're not going to believe this, but I'm going to skip over step E because it's very complicated and it doesn't add a lot to the narrative here. It's like a subplot. But let's go to step F, which is so long and so painful. I'm just going to focus on one thing that's probably relevant, and that is, otherwise, if the current node's role allows for the name from content, return the accumulated text. So I just want to pull apart that little bit for us. So some ARIA role attributes allow this thing called name from content. And that means that the text in these elements becomes the accessible name. And that's for elements that wouldn't natively be in the accessibility tree. Now, there's a full list of them at the document called roles supporting names from content, or that section of the document. And so you could see a full list of them. But I'll give you one quick example here. So in this example, we've got a div that has a role of button, and therefore it's going to be able to produce an accessible name. So the markup would be div, role equals button, the text in the button says help. So because, even though it's a div, because it has a role, and the role is button, which means it's one of those ones that can produce an accessible name, the accessible name for that div or button becomes help. Right, I don't know about you, but I'm exhausted. So the last one is step G. Otherwise, if the current node is a text node, return the textual contents. And so in this case, we just have a link and it uses the accessible name. So we have A, hello world, and that becomes the accessible name. So we're through. But I'm going to simplify all that down because that's a very, as I said, I really pulled that apart to a simple document, but we're going to look at some very quick examples here. So you probably noticed that throughout this document, it's a series of steps and it says otherwise, otherwise. So it should start at the top and then go down. So highest, lowest in priority. So let's look at A and button elements because they have pretty well the same process. So in the case of A and buttons, as well as elements with a role of button and a role of link, the order would be this. Use ARIA label by. If that's not present, otherwise use ARIA label. Otherwise use the element subtree, which is any children elements inside it or their text nodes. Otherwise, in the last case, use the title. And if none of them occur, you can't produce an accessible name. So we're going to go through other examples, but someone asked me the other day, what would happen if you use multiple options to an object? Well, I'm going to show you a series of very, very strange examples, and they should never be used in the wild, but it's really just to show this cascade effect. So what we have here is a button, and it's got ARIA label by red, ARIA label blue, title pink, and the actual text for the button is green. This is the most horrifying example you'll ever see, so please don't ever do this. But which one's going to win? Well, because ARIA label by is the highest priority, the accessible name for this weird button would be red. And you can actually see this in the accessibility tree, just like with CSS, it actually crosses out the ones that don't win. So I'm looking at a screenshot of the name computation, and the name says red, and then it's got ARIA label by red. But below that, it's got ARIA label blue, and that's crossed out because it's been beaten. And down below that, it's got contents, which is green, and that's been beaten. And then at the very last one, it's got title, which is pink, and that's been beaten. So it actually shows you the one that's winning. If you could, very similar to CSS in a way. So here's our second example. So ARIA label by is gone, and now we just have button, ARIA label blue, title pink, and then the button text is green. So which one wins? Well, ARIA label is the next in priority, so the accessible name for that button would be blue. Okay, now we have a button and it just has title equals pink and the text which is green. So which one wins here? Well, the title is the lowest in priority. So in this case, the actual button text would be red, announced as the accessible name. So it would be green. And then our final insane example is where there's no text at all, but there is a title. So in this case, we have button, title pink, and nothing else. Only in that case, then the browser will go, dear God, and then it will just say, okay, fine, you can have it. And then the accessible name would be pink. Oh, that's exhausting, isn't it? How about we go on to the image element? So this is a case similar to the others, but with a tiny few caveats. Very similar, always start with. First of all, is there an ARIA label by? Use that. Otherwise, use ARIA label. Otherwise, use the alt attribute. And if not that, as a last resort, again, use the title. And again, if nothing else present, then you've got to produce an empty string. And the next one I want to talk about is a range of input selects and text errors. There are some that don't fall in this category. So we're fundamentally talking about input type equals text, password, email, those fundamental ones, selects and text errors. These would follow roughly along these lines. Again, as before, ARIA label by first, ARIA label now. If it's got an associated label or series of labels, they would be used. Then the title, then the placeholder would be last. And I'm going to talk about the placeholder in a minute. And if none of those are present, again, you've got an empty string. So you'll see there's a pattern through all of them that's fundamentally the same with a few little caveats depending on the types of elements. So to wrap up, I'm going to be talking about fixing some poor examples. And really what we want to do here is work out how we can improve some accessible names on some examples. And I'm sure you've all seen these in the wild, these evil designers and developers. So a classic example, similar to the one I talked about before earlier in the talk, is a button which only has an icon inside the button. So this means there's no text string, which means there's no accessible name. And so what we have is a button, and inside the button we have an I element, and it's got a class. Now those that are familiar with it would know this is a Bootstrap thing, a font awesome thing, sorry. And it's got FA trash, which is fundamentally going to take that I element and replace it with a background image or SVG, etc., of a little icon, in this case, a trash icon. So what the designer or developer wanted to do is not have any text there, but just have a little icon for trash or deleting. But unfortunately, there's no text string, so there's no accessible name. Now, one way I could fix it is just to use an ARIA label. And so we could just go ARIA label, delete item, and suddenly that becomes the text string that can be used as the accessible name. So we can keep the visual style as it is, but we can provide a much more useful accessible name for assistive technologies. Let's talk about links. So I'm sure you've all dealt with this in the past where you've got a designer, a developer, and there's lots of links on the homepage and they all say more, and they don't want to have lots of text on there. They want them just to say more. So the text might be something like the markup might be something like href, more, and the accessible name is more. So there's an accessible name, but it's a pretty shitty accessible name. It doesn't provide any context and would fail, I'm sure, other criteria, but if nothing else, would fail the 2.4.4, link purpose, etc. So if you had a designer or developer that didn't want to put anything more than that there, you could use other methods to provide more information, but still keep it looking like the more. And we can use a method we've already talked about, which is ARIA label. So ahref, ARIA label, and then the text says more, but we can use more about fruit. So it's got a better, that's not the best in the world, but it's got a better accessible name. But for many years before ARIA, we used to use a technique called off left. And I'm sure a lot of dinosaurs will be familiar with this technique. But basically, what you can do is you can take a piece of the text and give more information to screen reader users, but take that and put it off screen. So it becomes part of the accessible name when it's calculated, but it's not displayed. So in this case, we have ahref, and then the text says more, but there's another element inside with the span, and it's got a class to move it off screen, and that says about fruit. So that will still give an accessible name that's more valuable than just using more. I'm sure there's some purists in the room that would be spewing their hatred at these techniques, and fair enough, because they're sort of hacks to get around bad design. Now, I want to wrap up with the placeholder, which we talked about the title element being the work of Satan, and the placeholder is pretty much the same. In this example, a designer or developer just wanted an input, so it might be up in the search of the top of the website, so they don't feel there's a need for a label because everyone would know that that's a search box. So in this case, what they have is input placeholder equals search type equals text. So that is sort of the lowest of the low types, and that would produce an accessible name, but like a pretty terrible one. But even though it does produce an accessible name, it's really not a good alternative. And in fact, the HTML5 spec specifically says it should not be used as an alternative to a label. And it's got all sorts of accessibility issues. Many people have written about this, so you could quickly find it. Two quick examples is, if you don't style it, it's going to have very soft text color, which would fail color contrast guidelines. And the other one is not just for people that are cognitively impaired, but everyone. As soon as you start typing, that placeholder disappears. And I've literally gone to a website once and typed in a date of birth. And as I was typing, I realized I hadn't checked the formatting, and the format had gone. So I actually had to delete all the characters, see the placeholder come back in again, and then retype it. So it's a terrible, terrible thing. But if you have a developer or designer that doesn't want to display it, again, we can use this ARIA label as a solution. So we could just put input ARIA label search, and that will produce an accessible name. And again, way, way before this was ever invented, I'm talking back early in the 1950s, when all of us were young human beings developing websites, we used to use an off-left method again. And so what you can do is have an explicitly associated label using the for and ID, and can still have the word search as part of the label, but you hide that off screen. And then what would happen is when assistive technologies come to it, when they hit focus on the input, they'd get the accessible name of search. Again, not saying this is the best technique in the world, but if there's no other options, we can still produce an accessible name. So the bottom line is these three examples just show ways that you can produce meaningful accessible names without affecting the visual display of it, if and when you can't change that, if you've got designers and developers that refuse to help you in that front. So that's pretty well it. We've hacked our way through accessible names, and the only thing left to say is, by including really useful, meaningful accessible names on all your accessible objects, you can provide a better experience for everyone, especially those with assistive technologies. I think that's it for me. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Russ. That was a great, interesting talk, something very close to my heart. Something I think about on a daily basis. I was just actually thinking about the first time I ever did a presentation, which was at a conference called Web Essentials. It was Web Essentials, wasn't it? Which you were running at the time, or one of the people running. That was in 2005, and it was about the title attribute. So yes, I am someone who bangs on about things continuously for years and years and years, to no avail in most cases. But anyway,
Can I go back even further, Stephen? You and I met the year before at Aussieway,
Yeah.
and you gave that exact title talk there. And I remember sitting in the audience doing it there, which is why I asked you to come to Web Essential. So the first time I saw it was probably.
Oh, did I? I couldn't. That
So
was,
there you go.
yeah.
Your
Yeah. Thanks for
hatred.
that. I didn't realise that I gave that talk the year before. Wow.
Yeah. So your hatred goes back, but your hatred of the title goes back eons.
Yeah, I do remember at the time thinking when I did that presentation was that it's a really sort of edge subject. You know, it's an obscure subject, but it's just been something that has continued on for eons. So
yeah,
there's nothing too obscure when it comes to web standards. That's for sure. So, Makoto, do we have any questions?
Thank you so much, Russ. It was very informative talk, especially for those who are new to accessibility, I think. I'd like to translate English caption to Japanese to share your talk with more Japanese developers.
Happy
it was
to.
really awesome. Thank you so much. I have one question for you. Are there any resources you can recommend for developers to learn more about accessible names?
Yes, and I wonder if I could stop this presentation because there's probably some links I could share. I don't know whether you're still seeing my screen, but without, it sounds like this is a love fest for Steve here, but there is a document called, let's scroll to the top here. If you really want a detailed dive into it, as well as the one I was talking about, which is the using ARIA, but there's one here called the Accessible Name Description Computation. But the other one is, sorry, I'm going to the wrong screen. Oh, I hate when you get across. Here it is. I keep getting the zoomed info across the top bar. I have to close. There we go. So there's another one called the HTML Accessibility API Mapping. And if you go down to 5, that really has a really good breakdown of each of the elements and shows that exact order that I was talking about there. So for those that really want a deep dive, that'll actually show you exactly how each element, the accessible names, are presented. But the bottom line is, the best thing to do is, as Sarah did in her talk before, start using the DOM, start playing with the accessibility tree, and you very quickly be able to see what are accessible names. And both Firefox and Chrome are like learning aids. They actually show you how those accessible names come into play. I really love Chrome, especially that it will cross out ones to show you which one sort of trumps the other one. So yeah, there's those formal documents, but also just playing with the accessibility tree.
Thank you so much. I'm watching YouTube and Twitter. It looks like we don't have no more questions so far.
All good. Thank you very much for having me.
Steve, do you have any? Yes, Steve, do you have any questions?
I was going to. Well, it was not so much a question, but when you were talking about the placeholder, the use of placeholder as a label, I would point out that is a failure of. I can't remember which, but it is a failure of
a WCAG criteria.
Best criteria, because it is not a persistent label. So, because as you were saying, when people type in, it goes away, and which is no good for people with cognitive issues. So it's something that should be, even though Apple say in their design guidelines that, you know, for iOS or whatever, that it's a legitimate design pattern. It's not a legitimate design pattern for accessibility and usability. Full stop.
Completely agree. Terrible. Like the title, they both should be banned for life.
Yeah.
Cool.
Man, kill them all.
Yes.
Sorry, I should say that.
Thanks very much. Have a great night, everyone.
Okay, we will.
Domo arigatou.
Thanks again.
Thank you.